In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 14,
where in this chapter we will go over monetary policy by considering the money market in order to go over expansionary monetary policy as well as contractionary monetary policy, where in today's discussion on the money market, we will do so by setting up some preliminaries in order to go over money demand, then money supply, put the two together in order to examine the money market, then conclude with investment. Where, in regards to our preliminaries, in our development of monetary policy thus far, we have defined money, examined how money is created through deposit creation, examined the structure of the Federal Reserve, as well as examined the three tools the Federal Reserve has at their disposal in terms of controlling the money supply. This then leaves us with the current tasks of developing the money market, establishing the link between the money supply and aggregate demand, then developing monetary policy, where, using our information from the prior two chapters, we will focus on the money market and establishing the link between the money supply and aggregate demand first in this video. Where, to begin, money is a good that is traded in a market. Thus, we can turn to our framework of supply and demand, where society, that is consumers and firms, will demand money, whereas the Federal Reserve will supply money. The equilibrium of the money market will determine the quantity level for money as well as its corresponding price point, where the price point of money is going to be the interest rate, or in other words, the price paid for the use of money, in that the higher the interest rate, the more expensive it is to borrow money, whereas the lower the interest rate, the cheaper it is to borrow money. So, to see this, let us now develop the money market, where, beginning with money demand, this is going to be quantities of money the public wants to hold at alternative interest rates, where this then poses the question of why would agents, that is consumers and firms, want to hold on to money instead of holding their money in interest-bearing assets such as savings accounts, CDs, bonds, stocks, etc., given that if they hold on to cash, they cannot be generating interest. That is, by holding cash, they are giving up the potential for earning interest. That is the opportunity cost for holding on to cash. Well, the answer is going to be a few different reasons. The first is going to be transaction demand, in that consumers and firms are going to want to have a little bit of money set aside to be able to make everyday purchases. From the perspective of consumers, we can think about this of going to the grocery store to make daily purchases for your food, or weekly purchases for your food, or just other everyday type transactions. Whereas from the perspective of the firm, they also need some money set aside to be able to make some purchases for their supplies in order to produce goods and services, or just for their factors of production in general for the production process. A second explanation is going to be precautionary demand, in that life is uncertain. Things will go about that we did not anticipate. Therefore, we should have some sort of insurance to cover ourselves from that regard of uncertainty. Where if we think about this from a consumer perspective, a consumer driving their car a lot, their car is bound to fail at some point. Therefore, they should have some extra money set aside that they can use to take their car to a repair shop and also be able to repair their car. Likewise, from the firm's stance, if one of their key machines to produce their good or service fails, they need to have some extra money set aside to be able to repair that machine or be able to replace it. And lastly, we have speculative demand, in that consumers and firms have expectations on the future. Here we can think about expectations on these interest-bearing assets. If the price of a bond or a stock currently is pretty high, but consumers and firms anticipate that it'll be cheaper in the future, they will hold on to some cash in the current period, not purchase the bond and stock, and wait for it to become cheaper in the future period as a result of their anticipation. So, with transaction, speculative, and precautionary demand, this then explains an inverse relationship between the interest rate and money demanded. This will then generate us a downward sloping money demand curve, which we see below, where in regards to a money market, we have interest rates on the vertical axis and we have the quantity of money on the horizontal axis. due to transaction, speculative, and precautionary demand. There's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and quantity of money demanded, generating us a downward sloping money demand curve in blue. So then, with money demand covered, let us now proceed to the money supply, where we know that we can define this in terms of M1 and M2, where the M1 money supply is going to be currency held by the public plus balances in transaction accounts, which we know this means cash, checking accounts, as well as traveler's checks. This is the most liquid form of the money supply, and we also have M2, which is slightly less liquid in that it's M1 plus money in savings accounts as well as money market mutual funds, where money in savings accounts and money market mutual funds are not as straightforward to use in terms of making everyday transactions with. We also know through our prior chapter that the Federal Reserve controls the money supply through their use of the required reserve ratio, setting the discount rate, as well as conducting open market operations. So, given that the Federal Reserve controls the money supply, this then means it's independent of the interest rate. With the money supply being independent of the interest rate, this then generates a vertical money supply curve, which we see below in green, where once again, interest rates are going to be on the vertical axis, quantity of money is on the horizontal axis. So with money demand and money supply covered, let us now put the two together in order to examine the money market, which we have graphically on the right, where once again, interest rates is going to be on the vertical axis, quantity of money is going to be on the horizontal axis. We have our downward sloping money demand curve due to the inverse relationship between the interest rate and quantity of money demanded. And we have a vertical money supply curve due to the Federal Reserve controlling the money supply and it being independent of the interest rate. In terms of equilibrium in the money market, this is going to occur at the intersection of money demand and money supply, in which there's no excess quantity demanded or excess quantity supplied in terms of money, where in our model, this occurs at the interest rate R star and at the quantity level of money M star, where should the interest rate be above the level of R star, this would then correspond to a surplus in money, in which consumers and firms are holding on to too much M1. Therefore, they would deposit some of their M1 and convert it into M2, which would push down the interest rates and take us back to equilibrium. Whereas on the other hand, should the interest rate be below R star, this then corresponds to consumers and firms holding on to not enough M1 that they would like, corresponding to a shortage. Therefore, they would then convert some of their M2 to M1, which would then have the effect of pushing up the interest rate, taking us back to equilibrium. So, with our money market covered in terms of how equilibrium is determined, how do changes in equilibrium in the money market occur? A primary way will be through the Federal Reserve, since they control the money supply, where by using the required reserve ratio, setting the discount rate, and conducting open market operations, the Federal Reserve can increase the money supply, which will have the effect of shifting the money supply curve to the right, leading to a new equilibrium. Likewise, they could also decrease the money supply, which would shift the money supply curve to the left and lead to a new equilibrium. So, let us consider this graphically then, where first we will consider increases in the money supply. Initially, we have our money market on the right. The intersection of money demand and money supply gives us our equilibrium interest rate R star and quantity level of money M star. The Federal Reserve, should they want to increase the money supply, we know that they can decrease the required reserve ratio, which will increase excess reserves, increase the money multiplier, which will then increase the lending capacity of the banking system, or they could decrease the discount rate, making it cheaper for private banks to borrow from the Federal Reserve, incentivizing them to do so, therefore increasing reserves and the lending capacity of the banking system. Or the Federal Reserve can purchase bonds, which means consumers and firms are selling bonds to the Federal Reserve, where transactions are then going to the consumer and firms' bank accounts, adding to reserves, which will then expand the lending capacity of the banking system, where by pursuing one of these options, the money supply then increases, which will correspond to a rightward shift in the money supply curve, going from MS to MS1 in purple, where the new equilibrium is going to occur at the intersection of MS1 and MD, giving us a new equilibrium interest rate R star 1 and quantity of money M star 1, where we see that this corresponds to an increased quantity level for money and a decreased interest rate. Now, doing the same, but for a decrease in the money supply, here we have our initial money market. Intersection of money demand and money supply gives us our equilibrium at R star and M star. Should the Federal Reserve want to decrease the money supply by increasing the required reserve ratio, pushing down excess reserves, as well as the money multiplier, pushing down the lending capacity of the banking system, or increasing the discount rate to disincentivize private banks from borrowing from the Federal Reserve, which will constrain the money supply, or by the Federal Reserve selling bonds such that consumers and firms purchase bonds from the Federal Reserve, therefore proceeds are leaving the consumers and firms' bank accounts and going to the Federal Reserve, which then decreases reserves, which then decreases the lending capacity of the banking system. Overall, one of these three will have the effect of decreasing the money supply, which then has the effect of shifting the money supply curve to the left, going from MS to MS2 in purple, where the new equilibrium in this money market is going to occur at the intersection of MS2 and MD, which we see occurs at the interest rate level R star 2 and the quantity of money M star 2, where we see that this corresponds to a decrease in the quantity level for money as well as an increased interest rate. So, with our money market established, we now want to consider the link between the money supply and aggregate demand, where in regards to the money supply, we know that this is controlled by the Federal Reserve, and in regards to the money market, we know that equilibrium determines the interest rate as well as the quantity of money. Now proceeding on to aggregate demand, we know that this is determined by consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, and that investment is inversely related to the interest rate, and that overall the aggregate product market determines the average price level as well as the real output level. Since we're concerned with the money supply and aggregate demand, the Fed controls the money supply, where by changing the money supply they can change the quantity of money in the market as well as the equilibrium interest rate. And in regards to aggregate demand, one of the components is investment, which is inversely related to the interest rate. So our link is going to be the interest rate, where with this link between the money supply and aggregate demand established being the interest rate, if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, then this would correspond to a fall in the interest rate, leading to an increase in investment, which would then correspond to an increase in aggregate demand. Where, to see this graphically, we have the money market on the left and our inverse investment function on the right. Our initial equilibrium corresponds to R star and M star, and our initial level of investment is interest rate R star and investment level I star, with an increase in the money supply. This then corresponds to a rightward shift in the money supply curve to MS1. At our new equilibrium, we have an increase in quantity of money and a decrease in the interest rate, where with a decrease in the interest rate, this then corresponds to downward movement along our inverse investment function corresponding to the interest rate R star 1 and our investment level I star 1, where we see that investment has risen, where we have seen in the past where if investment increases, this would then correspond to a rightward shift in aggregate demand. Now, secondly, we then also have the opposite case, in that if the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply, this would then translate into an increase in the interest rate, leading to a fall in investment and a fall in aggregate demand. We're considering that, we now have our initial money market equilibrium and our initial level of investment, where should the money supply fall due to the Federal Reserve using one of its tools, this corresponds to a leftward shift in the money supply curve, going from MS to MS2. Our new equilibrium in the money market is R star 2 at a quantity level M star 2, where we see that the interest rate has increased, where with an increase in the interest rate, this then corresponds to upward movement along our inverse investment function until we arrive at R star 2 at the quantity level of I star 2 in terms of investment, where we see that investment has fallen, where given that we've seen that with a decrease in investment, this then translates to a fall in aggregate demand corresponding to a leftward shift. So then with our money market derived and the link between the money supply and aggregate demand established, where we seek to pick up in our next video is by developing monetary policy.